Hello and welcome to the Yellow Gloves End of Year Awards Show. Now I know it's the first week of 2023. Actually, it's almost the second week of 2023. But I thought we'd look back at 2022. We never had the chance to since the podcast only launched in 2023, and we also had to wait for the end of year show to happen for Cage Warriors. So here we are. It's the awards show. It's finally time. I want to quickly take you all through the categories that we'll be looking at in this show. We're going to have a Fighter of the Year award, a Fight of the Year award, Finish of the Year. So I don't want to discriminate between knockouts and submissions. We're going to have an Event of the Year award, and then we're going to have Performance of the Year, and finally Newcomer of the Year. So by and large, I think it's been a really, really strong year for Cage Warriors. I said this in the last episode. I think Cage Warriors had a very promising year in terms of different types of champions. We've had the Italian guys really come over and do a crazy job of just dominating in fights, winning belts. We've had champions who have joined the UFC or on the cusp of joining the UFC. We've had some insane title fights. We've had unification bouts. We've had rematches. It's really been a year of, or it really was a year of high quality for Cage Warriors in 2022. And I think it's good to give some of these fighters a spotlight with all of these categories that I'll be going through. I did want to do more categories, but then I didn't want you all to listen to like a 2 hour show. So I guess we're going to stick to what I've mentioned. So I guess to start it all off, the one that people are always really interested in is Fighter of the Year. I'm going to have 4 picks per category. I may have 5 in one of them because I can't decide and I suck. Fighter of the Year for me was a really, really tough one. I think first and foremost, I should probably let you all know what kind of factors into my decision for Fighter of the Year. I think Fighter of the Year for me has to have been involved in some title bouts. I think that's super important, first and foremost. I think you have to have fought for a belt or been there or thereabouts in the discussion. I think you need to have obviously won some fights. I don't have anyone here who's only had one fight. I did almost put Paul Hughes in just because he was so good against Jordan Vucenic, but we'll obviously probably talk about Paul Hughes at a later stage, right? So Fighter of the Year has to be, like I said, someone who's consistently fought in 2022, someone who's been involved in title fights, and someone who's turned in good performances against a good caliber of opponent. And I managed to get it down to 4 fighters. So I'm just going to rattle through my 3 nominees, talk a little bit about them, and then we'll have our winner. So my first nominee was Christian Leroy Duncan. I think Christian Leroy Duncan had an insane year, and I was so close to giving this award to him. He had 2 fights in 2022, both title bouts. He beat Jati Milan, which was his first fight. Insane knockout win over Jati, who'd been controlling him a little bit in the earlier rounds, clinching him up, taking him down, and then Christian Leroy Duncan decided he'd had enough, done his usual spinny stuff, knees, everything. Like the guy's just an absolute wrecking ball. And then towards the end of the year, fought again, another crazy knockout, had the spinning attack in there as well. And then he got signed by the UFC, right? He was supposed to fight Jesse Taylor on that end of year award show. I think he was supposed to fight Jesse Taylor on the end of year Cage Warriors show, not the award show, because that's what we're doing here. And if that had happened and he had beaten Jesse Taylor, who's a credible, former UFC fighter, I think potentially I would have put Christian Leroy Duncan in there. But it wasn't to be. I obviously have chosen someone else. A couple of other nominees for me, Jim Warhead, so Judo Jim. Very, very close as well with Judo Jim. I think I'm already kicking myself, like just talking about them a little bit, because I feel like potentially I could have argued their cases a bit better against who I have chosen. Judo Jim had an insane year. He takes, I think he's out for 3 years, comes back in 2022, has an insane knockout win over Skabinski. I didn't really give him a chance against Skabinski, and I'm a big Judo Jim fan, but I thought with all the injuries, his age, talks of retirement, and Skibber being just an absolute monster and someone who's down to bang, right? And Judo Jim goes in there, knocks him out. It's an insane moment. It's the Cage Warriors anniversary show. It's a beautiful moment, and at that moment I thought, okay, cool. We will talk about Judo Jim at some point, if because I'd already been toying around with the idea of a podcast, and I thought, okay, Judo Jim's definitely going to be in the awards show to some capacity, just off that. And then what does he do a few months later? He goes and takes on Matt Figlak, who's the brother of Mike Figlak. He's obviously the underdog. Interim Cage Warriors welterweight belt, which I disagree with them doing a belt, but that's neither here nor there. Again, underdog. You think Figlak's going to win. What does Judo Jim do? First round goes in there, sparks him out. And I think that almost had me at we will talk about Judo Jim later, but I think he was almost there for me. Almost. The other person who's also a nominee is Michele Martignoni. So Martignoni being the Italian fighter who took on Dominic Wooding, had a great year in Cage Warriors, won all of his fights. The Wooding fight was insane. Another one we'll talk about later. Almost had him in, didn't really give him a chance against Wooding. So I think just off the basis of him really surprising me this year, he was almost in there. But I have to factor in caliber of opponent, the way that this fighter fought throughout the year, and all of their accomplishments, right? And I landed on one. And for me, the Yellow Gloves inaugural 2022 Fighter of the Year is George Hardwick. George had an insane year, like truly insane. For me, he's one of the best fighters in Cage Warriors. I highly doubt he will fight again in Cage Warriors because I really do think he's UFC bound. But Hardwick had 3 fights in 2022. All of them he wins by knockout. So round 2 knockout, a round 4 knockout, and a round 2 knockout again. Lucas Capero was the first one. This was back in March, I believe. Wins by a combination of knees and punches. But for me, I think the most important fights were the Kyle O'Driscoll one, because that's when the belt was on the line, the vacant lightweight belt. Kyle O'Driscoll, on the cusp of the UFC, right? He had his his Contagious series. Yeah, that's exactly what it's called. He had his Dana White Contender Series fight, and he won. It was a pretty boring decision. Didn't really get the call up to the UFC, and so signs for Cage Warriors. Loses out on his first fight due to some injury, and then obviously lands on a title fight against George Hardwick. O'Driscoll being a grindy type wrestler, he's got the clinch and the grappling. He's a decent striker, and I thought, this is a good opportunity for George Hardwick against an international fighter, so a US fighter. How will he look? And oh my god, I mean, for me, it's one of the most aesthetically pleasing performances of 2022. George Hardwick goes in there, has a competitive fight with O'Driscoll. So I keep calling him O'Driscoll, Kyle Driscoll. Stop calling him O'Driscoll. Um, Goes in there with Kyle Driscoll, and as I said, it's competitive. It's a good fight. Driscoll has a lot of the clinchy type stuff. But George Hardwick, I mean, the anti-grappling is insane. I know a few pundits who are talking about Hardwick saying, he needs to show how he would fight against a grappler, which I think people always do with UK fighters. How will he do when he faces a grappler? This isn't the mid 2000s. This isn't the early 2010s. We have grapplers and we have people who can anti-grapple, and George Hardwick is one of those. And he showed it in this fight against Kyle Driscoll. He nullified a lot of the clinches, a lot of the takedowns, and it wasn't just the nullifying of it, because it takes more than that to win a fight and to make an impression. You can nullify takedowns and clinches as much as you want, but what are you doing offensively? And what George Hardwick did was what he always does, which is a complete war of attrition. It's strikes to the legs, strikes to the body, strikes to the head. Beautiful boxing combinations. George Hardwick's boxing is absolutely insane. If I had to compare him to someone, he reminds me a little bit of Max Holloway. For those who want kind of like a stylistic comparison, he's got the anti grappling in his back pocket, probably not to the same level as Max, but then the boxing, he doesn't discriminate, right? He's not headhunting in there. He's chopping at the lead leg, which is obviously not boxing. But then with his hands, it's hooks to the body, lead uppercuts, then straight shots to the head, jabs to the head. He's absolutely nuts. And his post-fight interview, or whatever you want to call whatever it was that was, he went mental, right? And I think George Hardwick is just, he's pure entertainment. He's an absolute stud of a fighter. But that wasn't all that he did in 2022, right? He wraps up his belt, comes back 4 months later, fights Chris Bungard. So Bungard's a vet, actually someone I'm surprised has never fought in Cage Warriors before, just because he's been around the UK MMA scene for such a long while. Um, up until this year, of course, I know he did have a Cage Warriors fight prior to this, but he'd only really joined the organization in 2022, and I was surprised to see George Hardwick fight him, but it was only because at the time we'd all built this up in our heads. It would always be George Hardwick versus Mike Figlak. That's the fight that we all wanted. Figlak gets called up on short notice to UFC London. Oh no, it was UFC Paris. Yeah, he gets called up on short notice to UFC Paris, and we lose Figlak, so we lose the Hardwick fight with Figlak, and then we get the Chris Bungard fight. Bungard's a vet, really, really tough dude, decent grappler, like most of the Scottish fighters, right? I think they get slept on a lot if we're talking about UK fighters and grappling, and people saying UK fighters can't keep up with the grappling. Potentially true, but also not a bit of a cliche, right? You look at the Scots, your Paul Craigs, your Reese McEwens, we'll talk about later, Bungard as well. Bungard's a really good striker, really good grappler as well. Ross Houston. There's quite a few, right? And then you look at the Welsh guys as well, Mason Jones, Jack Shaw. I'm going on a tangent, but I just hate the cliche. Um, but in the Bungard fight, it's more of the same from Hardwick. It's nullifying the wrestling and the clinching and grappling of Bungard, exchanging strikes with Bungard, who's super super tough. But Hardwick finds a way, as always does, to switch people off, and he does it with a beautiful body shot in that fight. Nice lead hook to the body, and it's cumulative damage with Hardwick. He's not going to go in there and spark someone out with one shot, but what he's going to do is build up to that moment. And I think for me, defending his belt, winning the belt, finishing all of his opponents, the caliber of opponent he fought, especially Kyle Driscoll, relative to what some of the other guys came up against. For me, I've got to give Fighter of the Year to George Hardwick, but I wouldn't begrudge anyone for picking any of the other nominees. And just a really quick honourable mention, I almost had Luke Riley in here, but the caliber of opponent wasn't there for me with Luke. I think he's potentially someone we'll talk about next year. So now we're going to look at Fight of the Year. I'm going to keep saying this throughout the show, but this was a really, really tough category to choose a fight from. I had a bunch of fights that I wanted to put in here. I managed to narrow it down to four nominees. Um, well, yes, four nominees, one winner, of course. We're going to look at the three nominees first, and then we'll talk about the winner at length. So I had Samuel Bark versus Tobias Harila as one of my nominees. Um, Bark and Harila was mental at the time of that fight happening. We didn't really know who Bark was. He had the cool kind of Ramon Decker's kind of throwback with his nickname. We knew he was a Muay Thai guy, and we know Tobias Harila, as like I said in the last pod, he's probably the maddest man in MMA right now. And you had a feeling that it might be fireworks, and it absolutely was. Samuel Bark was absolutely insane in this fight. I thought, we don't know this guy. Harila's going to go in. He's going to beat the brakes off Bark. And actually, what happened was it was a very competitive, all-out striking affair. A little bit of clinching in there, just displaying the versatility of both fighters in those positions. But we all know Harila can grapple, chooses not to, right? Prefers to just throw hands. And Bark obliged. And yes, we had a finish. It didn't really last that long. It goes, I think, halfway through the second round. That was one of my nominees for Fight of the Year. A really fun, competitive fight, a really, really good finish in there, and kind of the emergence of Samuel Bark as a fighter that we should probably keep an eye on. The next nominee was George Hardwick, Kyle Driscoll. I've literally just spoken about it, so I don't need to say much more. It was competitive for a round or so, and then you start to see George Hardwick pick up the pace. It's one of those where it's less competitive of a fight, I would say, than the others, but it has a pendulum swinging a little bit within the fight. There's really high technical ability between both fighters, which I always lean towards. I try to avoid kind of I mean, we all love a slobber knocker, we all love a crazy out and out war, but for me, I like to see a high level of technique in fights, and I think Hardwick and Kyle Driscoll had that in their fight. My last nominee for this category before we look at the winner is Martignoni versus Dominic Wooding. This fight was awesome. Wooding drops Martignoni in the first round. I believe it's in the first, and then we start to think, it's actually good if I give a bit of context. So going into this fight, this was the Rome card in Italy. All the Italians had won on the card leading up to this fight, and so we were watching this from two types of angles. One was can the Italians sweep the card, but we were also watching it from Wooding's perspective, which is this is one of the more highly touted prospects in Cage Warriors, probably on the cusp of the UFC or one of the bigger promotions. It felt like this was going to be a nice title moment for Wooding, title defense, and Martignoni goes in there, gets dropped early, and you start to think this is Wooding's fight. This is exactly what we were tuning into. It's going to be a beatdown. And then round two, round three, round four, and you start to think, shit, like Martignoni might be winning this fight. And it's just the pendulum starts swinging pretty heavily from one side to the other. Martignoni starts to take over. It's a really, really high level fight. The only reason that I've not got it as the winner is because it does, unlike the other fights, it does lack the finish. And not that, some of my favorite fights have never were never finished. Some of my favorite fights have gone the distance in MMA. But I think comparing it to what did win, I just couldn't pick anything. And we'll just go straight into it. I could not pick anything over Reese McKee versus Justin Burlinson. For me, that's the fight of the year because it was competitive. There was a high level of technique between both fighters, both on the ground and on the feet. We had a crazy finish that came out of nowhere. We had a comeback in the fight. We had a nice storyline, which was people always remember Reese McKee as the guy who lost to Hamzat, and he proved that he's not just that. It's in Belfast, it's in Northern Ireland, hometown. He gets the job done, coming from behind. It's a bonkers fight. The atmosphere is mad. If you go back and watch that fight, the atmosphere the whole night was crazy. But when Reese McKee walks out and throughout the fight, it's insane. Little bits about the fight. I mean, McKee starts off with a really nice pawing jab, like super clean, super accurate. Burlinson has that really good forward pressure. I think that's one of Burlinson's key strengths is he is hittable, but he's always moving forward and he's trying to make the fight dirty and get on top of fighters, find a way to get it to the ground and to dominate. But even in that forward pressure, right? Like Burlinson in that first round wasn't just trying to grapple McKee. He hits him with loads of overhand rights. McKee as well is super hittable, right? These are two guys that love scrapping. These are two guys that love to fight and you got that in the first round. Jab 1-2 from McKee, really clean shots to the body, like a tidy arsenal of attrition. I love fighters that don't discriminate like a George Hardwick. If you're going leg, body, head, that's a lot more interesting to me than someone who's just head hunting in there. Burlinson doesn't quite have the volume of McKee in this fight, but he doesn't waste his strikes. There's minimal volume, but everything lands on the feet. There's one point where he hits like triple jab, and you just see McKee's head just snap 3 times. Really, really nice first round. But what would go into kind of defining this fight was Burlinson's wrestling. McKee's always been a solid defensive grappler, and I know people listening to this probably thinking, "Me, Hamzat," but let's disregard a world class fighter here. Like McKee's always had super good defensive grappling and good offensive grappling. He's able to get his chokes in, good front headlock, the anaconda choke. He's got those kind of submissions in his arsenal, those front headlock submissions. Um, and I think Burlinson does a good job of actually being the dominant grappler in this fight. Towards the end of the round, he has a really nice trip takedown, kicks the rear leg like a nice foot sweep, brings McKee down, and we'd see that takedown return throughout the fight. The most telling part for Burlinson was he manages to always get the handcuff in on the ground, and it's just strike after strike on McKee. And when the first round ends, you think McKee might be done here. He's got this really, really nasty cut above his eye. Like if you've watched Versosa versus Stoliarenko in Invicta, that cut that Versosa had, that's like just nasty, right? Like it's really like a really deep cut on the face and really visceral. And you look at Burlinson and he's got his eyes starting to swell up, and you know it's going to be one of those fights even after 5 minutes. But you start to think there's going to be a stoppage in here. There's going to be a doctor stoppage. Doctor comes in between rounds before the second round, looks at McKee's eye, and already you're like, yep, this is going to end now. Referee lets it go on, but you just know second round something's going to happen. Doctor's going to stop the fight, and we actually don't get that. So And beginning of the second round, Burlinson immediately, like literally the first action of the round, powers through on a double leg takedown. Beautiful work, gets McKee down. There's little resistance from McKee, in all honesty. Traps the arm and resumes that position with the handcuff. McKee does, in fairness, does well to try and negate that dominant position from Burlinson. He he posts up at one point, manages to get back to his feet, almost gets caught in a heel hook, knee bar. The good thing about McKee and why I say he's a good defensive grappler as well is because there's a moment in the fight where Burlinson gets him in kind of like he's trying to set up a heel hook, right, or a knee bar. He's transitioning from one to the other, and McKee crosses his legs, which is albeit a basic and standard technique, but to think about those moments and how to defend those positions while you're also bleeding profusely and getting beaten up and in a title fight in front of your home crowd, it takes a good level of understanding of fighting and a good level of concentration, and that really impressed me from McKee. But it's the second round is all the grappling from Burlinson. It's strike after strike after strike on the ground. The heel hooks, the knee bars, the armbar attempts. McKee just survives, right? This fight is pure survival for McKee. End of round one, you think he's in trouble. End of round two, survives somehow. When when they go to the doctors again, you start to think fight's going to end. It doesn't, and then third round is where the magic happens, right? Burlinson's eye is literally swollen shut by this point. You cannot see, like you cannot see an eyeball. Basically, it's complete swelling on one eye, and the other eye's fine. And then McKee's just got the same nasty gash on his head and across his eye. It looks like he's been in a fight with like an army of scissors. And immediately, Burlinson tries to come in, do the clinch, and McKee just defends the clinch really well, manages to shake Burlinson off, hits him with a nice shot. It's even on a replay, it's hard to tell what he hits him with initially. It's kind of like it's a right hand, but I guess a bit of a lead uppercut. It's not really obvious. Burlinson gets clipped quite clearly, gets clipped. Buckles a little bit, but like most wild fighters would do, what does Burlinson do? Tries to do a spinning elbow, spinning back fist, you know, a combination between the two. He's just spinning to survive. And McKee wises up to that, manages to kind of circle out, and then hits him this time with a really good right uppercut, straight left down the pipe, sends Burlinson crashing down. It happens so fast, you think, what the hell's going on? But the way that Burlinson falls, and he's kind of, if you've watched Kevin Holland versus Jacare, it has that moment of Burlinson's kind of folded up against the fence. He's on his knees, but folded up against the fence. And Rich Mitchell does an amazing job to stop the fight. It's a crazy comeback win for McKee. I counted him out after that first round with that cut. Not based on McKee's inability to win a fight, but more that I felt like he'd get hit and he would continue bleeding and it would get stopped. And actually what he did was make an insane comeback in front of his home crowd to win a belt. People think that he was a champion before in Cage Warriors before he joined the UFC. He actually wasn't, though he had a decent run in Cage Warriors. He never actually won the belt. So this was his first time winning gold. He's still the Cage Warriors welterweight champ. Judo Gym is the interim welterweight champ, and I'm sure they will unify those belts in 2023. But for me, that was the fight of the year. It had the technical. I love when you get scrambles and grappling where both fighters are equally adept, so they cancel each other out with really smooth techniques. And I love the crazy striking, the slobber knocker. It gave me everything that I like to see in a fight. So I think Cage Warriors 140, Reese McKee versus Justin Burlinson, that was my fight of the year. Now we move on to finish of the year. I had 5 nominees here. I tried to get it down to 4. I mean, initially I had 8. I got it down to 5. I couldn't get it down to 4. So I'm going to not spend as much time talking about them, and I'm just going to say what some of them are. Firstly, we had Christian Leroy Duncan versus Jati Milan to capture the belt. Insane knockout. Go and watch it. I won't even bother breaking it down. It's better if you just go and see it. We had Shajidul Haq versus Sam Creasy. Literally just happened end of year, and this is why you wait until the end of the year to do your award shows, because if I'd done this prior, then I wouldn't have been able to put Huck and Creasy in, which is absolutely one of the best knockouts of the year. Flattens Creasy with a beautiful right hand, wins the belt. It's got everything that you want to see in a finish of the year. Then you've got Jan Quayhagens versus Eric da Silva. Ridiculous knee knockout. One of my favorite knees in all of combat sports this year. It's right up there with Yuki Motoya versus Rogerio Bontorin on the Rising New Year's Eve show. We actually had two nasty knee knockouts in that event, but Motoya Bontorin was awesome. Jan Quayhagens versus Eric da Silva, absolutely brilliant as well. Now, the last two, obviously, one of them is the winner. The other one is just a nomination. And they're the two that, even while I'm talking now, I still haven't quite made my mind up. But I'm not going to do it joint because, you know, that's not how I roll. I want to have an absolute number one finish of the year. And I think we'll talk about the nominee. Actually, I'll give you a bit of context between, I guess, on how I pick a finish of the year. So, finish of the year has to have a lot of things. It's got to have the flash for me. One of these definitely had the flash. It's got to have a story behind it. So, you know, were you losing the fight? Did you make a comeback? Were you an underdog going into the fight? Is there something in the build up to the fight that made you an underdog? Like, I don't know, did you have a broken right hand, then knock the guy out with your right hand? The different storylines will always play into these finishes of the year. If there are title implications or if there is a title on the line, I will usually weigh my knockout heavier towards that, and I will disregard flash a lot more. And I think that's my way of setting up that my final nomination for this category before we talk about the winner was Manny Akpan versus Connor Hitchens. And I hate myself for not giving this to Manny because the knockout is absolutely insane. It's a wheel kick. I don't think it has a definition. I've rarely seen it in MMA. I mean, he dips down, I guess puts one hand to, it's like a capoeira thing that he's doing. Nice spinning kick. It's beautiful. It's an insane knockout. It's probably the most watchable knockout out of all of these on the list. I think it won Fight Pass Knockout of the Year as well. So all the third party promotions under the Fight Pass banner, Manny Akpan won that for Knockout of the Year. But my thing is, I guess why I've not given it the win is Connor Hitchens isn't really a big name in UK MMA or in MMA in general. There wasn't any title implications going into this fight. We didn't really expect much from it other than Akpan is crazy and is a really good prospect. So I think while it had all the flash in the world, it lacked the stakes, it lacked the story. So my finish of the year for 2022, or the yellow gloves finish of the year, is Judo Jim Allhead versus Matt Figlak at Cage Warriors 146. What Judo Jim did in this fight, and I hate that I talked about it earlier, but I'm probably going to rehash what I said. He goes into this fight, he's comes back after 3 years, beats Daniel Skabinski. Awesome fight. You think that's it for Judo Jim. He's had his moment. He's probably going to go retire. Vacant welterweight title fight falls in his lap. I don't know why. Sorry, not vacant, interim title fight. I don't know why they made an interim belt. I guess it was to do this big event and to have another belt on the line at this event. But for me, I think they should have left it with McKee. But what that did was it created another title fight, and this probably wouldn't be finish of the year without that title on the line. But Judo Jim goes into this fight, all the injuries in the world that he's had, the talks of retirement, his age. He's been in the UFC, he's been in Bellator, he's been everywhere. He's been in Cage Warriors, comes back to Cage Warriors after many, many years. It's a great story alone. And then you consider he's fighting Matt Figlak, whose brother has just joined the UFC. Matt's probably on the way to joining him as well. Probably if he wins this fight, we'll never know now. But I'd imagine if Matt Figlak had won this fight, you'd probably expect to see him in that UFC London card in March. So, Matt's the favorite. Judo Jim, it's more of the, can the underdog do it? Can the old man do it? And then it's that first round, and it's only one round, and it's absolutely insane. You see Judo Jim setting up some shots. Figlak is faster. Figlak is sharper. He's obviously the younger fighter, but it's the left hook from Warhead that really opens up the straight right hand. So he throws this left hook, Figlak reacts to it, puts his hands up, and then as he goes to guard the left hook, oh yeah, the left hook, Judo Jim comes in, straight right hand down the pipe. Figlak falls immediately, hammer fist to follow up. Just an insane moment. Judo Jim starts crying. The commentary is absolutely bonkers. You have Redmond just laughing throughout the whole thing, just saying, "Well done, Jimmy." It's just a special moment for UK MMA. It's probably the most emotional moment of the year. For me, of all the moments, you had Shad's knockout. You had Judo Jim's. I think Judo Jim's is definitely the most emotional one. If you followed UK MMA, you know Judo Jim, you know how hard he's fought to get back into competitive MMA, and then to see him win this fight by knockout in a title match against a young upstart who's probably going to be in the UFC in the next year, just showing that the old man still got it. And I think for me, that's the finish of the year. It's probably not as visceral as Jan Quayhagen's hacks or Leroy Duncan's. It's not got the flash that Manny Akpan's does, but it has all of the stakes and good technique behind the finish as well. So my finish of the year, or the Yellow Gloves finish of the year, is Judo Jim Moorhead versus Matt Figlak. So now we're going to look at performance of the year. I had 5 nominees in this one as well. Couldn't get it down to 4, so hate me if you must. But I really want to shout out these fighters. Performance of the year for me is a fighter that had an incredible performance in a singular fight. So this doesn't take into account their year as a whole. It just takes into account one performance in one fight. And some of these will be fighters we've already spoken about. Some of these will be fighters that we're going to talk about shortly in the next category. Performance of the year, 5 nominees, 1 winner. We'll start with the nominees as always. I had Samuel Bark versus Tobias Harila, which we've already spoken about. We didn't know who Bark was. Now he's one of the most touted prospects in Cage Warriors, one of the most exciting fighters in Cage Warriors. Had 7 fights in 2022. This was his crowning achievement, beating a gunslinger like Tobias Harila at his own game, knocking him out. Just a really, really special performance. I had 2 which I've already spoken about quite a lot. I had George Hardwick versus Kyle Driscoll, and then I had Martin Yoni versus Dom Wooding. I think the 2 of them were insane title fights as well. Like I've been saying, my performance of the year is always going to weigh heavily towards people who have been in title fights, who have had storylines built into that moment. And this next fighter didn't, and he's my performance of the year because of how surprising his win was to me. He's got, with Samuel Bark, it's a performance of the year because it's explosive. With Hardwick and Martignoni, it's performance of the year because there's titles involved. They're excellent performances. For the next man, which is Kalen Lochran against Luke Shanks, that for me was insane from Kalen Lochran. And I was really close to giving Kalen performance of the year. And we're going to talk about him very, very shortly. Kalen against Luke Shanks, I personally didn't give Kalen a chance. And it's not because I don't recognize his talent. I think he's insane. He's one of the most highly touted bantamweights in the UK right now, in the UK and Ireland. And just Kalen is brilliant. But Luke Shanks, for me, going into this fight as an underdog, I didn't get it because Luke Shanks is just someone we know is a proven quantity, is one of the best bantamweights in Cage Warriors, super exciting fighter. Yes, he has his losses, but he's fun and he's always got those moments of dominating fights, and he's been champion everything that you can think of. I just saw Kane Lochran. I thought, maybe he's too young. Maybe this is, he's been pushed a bit too quickly. But what he did to Luke Shanks was absolutely insane. I mean, you look back at Kalen's year in general, it was an insane year. And we will talk about that later, I promise. But just to talk about this fight against Luke Shanks, he absolutely dominates Luke Shanks, gets him to the ground in the first round, and you immediately think, oh crap, Kalen's got this man where he wants him in round 1. Kalen's threatening the chokes, nasty ground. He's such a big 135er, and not big in height, but just big in width and size. Like he's a big 135er, and you saw it when they locked the cage. And I saw the difference between him and Luke Shanks. I just thought, I now understand probably why Kalen was the favorite. And he just goes in there and he beats the brakes off Luke Shanks. I didn't expect that at all. I thought Luke Shanks would win a competitive fight, but I didn't see Kalen winning. And Kalen goes in there and yeah, beats the brakes off Luke Shanks. For me, that was one of my most surprising performances of the year. And Kalen had an excellent year. But my actual number one performance of the year, Yellow Gloves performance of the year for 2022, is Paul Hughes versus Jordan Vucenic. For me, Paul Hughes is one of the best fighters that isn't signed to a major organization in the entire world right now. He's an insanely talented grappler, an insanely talented striker, and against Jordan Vucenic, the reason why that fight for me saw him win Performance of the Year is because one it's the storyline going into it, right? We rarely get title matches being rematches in Cage Warriors, as in let me give you some context. So these guys fight a few years ago during the pandemic era. Vucenic wins a controversial-ish decision. I don't think it's as controversial as was made out by some of the fans at the time of it happening, right? I think it was a competitive fight, really hard to pick between the two. But I don't think it was a robbery in any way, right? So Jordan Vucenic wins that fight by split decision. That's in Cage Warriors 119, I believe. So definitely during the pandemic era. And like I said, you rarely get rematches in Cage Warriors. If you do, usually something dodgy's happened in the fight, as in someone's had their eye poked and they rematch a few months later, or it's an early stoppage. But these guys rematch 2 years later, and somehow they're both champions. So one's an interim champion, one's the actual champion. Vucenic being the actual champion, Paul Hughes being the interim. So you rarely get rematches. You rarely get rematches where titles on the line. You rarely get rematches between two of the best fighters in Europe, period, right? Forget weight classes. Paul Hughes and Jordan Vucenic, in my opinion, are two of the best fighters in Europe, both on the cusp of the UFC. This just doesn't happen in Cage Warriors. It doesn't happen in many promotions outside of the very top echelon of MMA. Right, we're talking your PFLs, Bellators, UFCs. Obviously not in that order. I probably should have said UFC first, but you know what I mean. The upper echelon of MMA, the bigger MMA promotions that can pay the big bucks, those are the ones where you see these fights happen. You don't see them in Cage Warriors, and we did. The atmosphere was electric. The walkouts lasted forever, and I loved every minute of it. I usually hate a long walkout, but it just felt deserved. The just the atmosphere and just the hype around the fight, and then the fight happens. It's a competitive first round for sure, and I think Vucenic definitely wins that round. But then Paul Hughes just totally dominates Vucenic from the second round all the way to the fifth. It's brutal, it's bloody. It reminded me a bit of Dolby and Houston, where you have all that blood in the cage and you start to realize like someone's getting really badly hurt here. When the fight ends, Vucenic just looks completely disfigured, right? He doesn't even look like himself. Just a dominant performance from Paul Hughes. Something I thought Hughes would win. I actually tweeted before the fight that I changed my opinion on who's going to win like around 50 times that week, and I feel like I really did. I had it on Tapology. I'd go Vucenic, I'd save it. 10 minutes later, I'd be like, nah, Paul's going to win. Let me go switch it to Paul, and then I'd switch it back to Jordan. And eventually, I settled on Paul Hughes just because I thought he had more of the tools to win the fight in the grappling department than Vucenic did. And boy, did we see it, right? Like Paul Hughes dominates him on the ground, threatens the submissions, but it's really the ground and pound, the elbows, cuts Vucenic up in multiple areas in his face. It's an absolutely gross fight. But you could see just how much Paul Hughes wanted it. And I think what makes it a performance of the year is sometimes fighters when they can't put a guy away, you see them switch off a little bit. A good example is like an RDA versus Moicano last year, to use a similar example, where fifth round comes, RDA's not put Moicano away, and Moicano starts to get a foot back in the fight because you can feel RDA starting to wilt a little bit because he just can't put the guy away, right? And I think for Paul Hughes to stay focused, to dominate throughout, and then in the final round to get a 10-8 round where he does his most amount of damage, I think was super special. I don't know how Vucenic survived the entire thing. It was just a total onslaught, just the dogged nature of Usyk. I can't wait to see him fight again. But Paul Hughes avenging his sole loss in MMA with a performance like that, probably cementing himself as the number one fighter in Cage Warriors. Probably the last time we saw him fight in Cage Warriors, because I think it would be an atrocity if he's not signed by a big major MMA promotion in 2023. That was the performance of the year. I can't argue for anyone else. It had the title fight, it had the moment, it had the total domination of one fighter over the other. I couldn't ever argue for any fighter over Paul Hughes. I could argue about the nominees, and I had certainly had a lot more than what I've shortlisted. But in terms of my number one performance of the year and the Yellow Gloves performance of the year, that goes to Paul Hughes versus Jordan Vucenic. All right, so here we are with the Newcomer of the Year award. I want to just give some context about how I've gone with this award. So, my newcomer of the year is always going to be someone who's fought for the very first time that year in Cage Warriors. So, I'm not going to give newcomer of the year to Luke Riley because Luke's been doing his thing for a good year and a bit now. He didn't debut in 2022, so guys like Luke Riley are completely out of the question. I've shortlisted this down to 4. One of the guys I left out that I just want to give an honorable mention to is Chasen Blair. Chasen Blair had an insane year, had the super quick 12-second knockout, did his thing for all of his fights in Cage Warriors. I just wanted to mention him. The only reason he's not an actual shortlisted nominee is because he didn't have the caliber of opponent that the other guys did, and we didn't see enough of his body of work. Like if you're just deading people in 12 seconds, it's hard to get an understanding of what you're good at, right? Um, but I think the guys I've brought down definitely all debuted in Cage Warriors in 2022. They are all up and coming fighters that are probably going to have insane years in 2023. So I'm going to start with my nominees and then we'll end with the winner. My first nominee for this award was Rhys McEwen. So I mentioned Rhys at the top of the show. Scottish fighter, insane grappler, really, really good submission skills. Comes into Cage Warriors in 2022. We don't really know much about him other than he's just a prospect from Scotland. And immediately we realized just how good this guy is. He has 3 fights in 2022. He fights Kingsley Crawford, Sam Spencer, and Teodoro Scollieri. So, not the craziest names. I think Kingsley Crawford is definitely a talented fighter, and that fight went to decision. Sam Spencer as well. He submits Sam Spencer and then submits Teodoro Scollieri towards the end of the year. It was just a really impressive year for Rhys McEwen. I can't wait to see more of him. Definitely a young fighter that we should all keep our eyes on. I think he's 26 or 27, so not young by means of a wonder kid type fighter, but someone who can still have an impressive career. I I didn't really see much of him against a higher level of opposition, but from what I did see of his against normal fighters of a similar caliber, I thought he was absolutely brilliant in 2022. Um, Looking at my other 2 nominees, I had Samuel Bark, which I feel like I've mentioned more than any other fighter in this podcast, and the guy's not even won an award, and he's not winning one here. Sorry, Sam. Samuel Bark was insane in 2023. In 2022. Probably shouldn't record this in 2023, but I had to wait for the end of year show to end, and I'm getting my years crossed up and being an idiot. Samuel Bark, excellent year. Fought 7 times, not in Cage Warriors, fought 7 times across other MMA promotions, right? But when he fought in Cage Warriors, he won all of his fights, knocks out Tobias Harila, which for me is special enough because Harila's just mad, and just a great fighter. And then he goes in against Manny Akpan, who we shortlisted for knockout of the year. And I thought, Manny's probably going to do something crazy to Samuel Bark. Bark ends up just dominating him, gets him with a really nasty knee in the clinch, finishes off with some ground and pound. And then Bark, the reason why I couldn't give him newcomer of the year is just because his final performance of the year was, it was a bit, it wasn't contentious, I don't think. And if you want to hear my thoughts on the fight in depth, go listen to episode 1 of the pod. He fights Orlando Wilson Prinz, and I don't want to be harsh about the performance. It wasn't one to write home about. There's an argument there that Orlando Wilson Prinz potentially might have won the fight. There's a lot of grappling from Samuel Bark, which was weird against a primary grappler like Prinz. But look, he got the job done. He won the decision and finished the year 3-0. So what more can you ask for, right? But another guy that I wanted to shout out and who did make the shortlist, and I feel like he's gotten a bit slept on this year, is Milad Ahadi. So Milad Ahadi's this really interesting fighter. He's from South Shields in England. Comes in. He's only had two fights in 2022, so it's probably worth me mentioning that right off the top. So he fights Antonio Sheldon, has a really kind of back and forth type fight with Antonio Sheldon, and then eventually takes over and starts to beat the hell out of Antonio Sheldon. He's one of those fighters that has a really deep tool set with regard to his striking. So a heavy kicking game, heavy hands as well. Not someone actually, you say heavy hands. He's not really had any knockout wins as a pro, but he's someone who deals damage over time, and I can see him getting a lot of finishes in 2023. And then his final fight in 2022 fights Tom Mearns. That was a more competitive fight against a vet like Mearns, but I don't know how Mearns survived that towards the end. Ahadi hit him with a lot of strikes, a lot of damage. Just a really dogged performance from Mearns. But Ahadi, I feel, hasn't gotten his flowers this year relative to some of the other guys I've mentioned. He's someone to keep an eye on. I mean, he's fought in Bellator. He's only, I want to say, he's potentially like 24 or 25. Um, he's only he fought in Bellator. Like I said, he lost. That's his only pro loss. So definitely someone there to keep an eye on in 2023. Definitely a newcomer of the year. But the my main guy and the guy I couldn't ignore for newcomer of the year, and it's why I didn't really want to talk about him much earlier in the pod, is Kalen Lochran. Kalen had an insane year. He had a dominant year, and in my opinion, is already right up there in the title picture at 135. It's hard to deny him much in that weight class. He, level of opponent. Bakhtiar was his first win in April. Bakhtiar is, we didn't really know much about him. Definitely someone who was thrown to him potentially for a win. But I mean, Kalen does what he does and handily finishes him in the second round. That was his first fight in Cage Wars, and he went 4-0 as a pro after that fight. And then, or he went 5-0. He was 4-0 at the time of fighting. And then his last two fights of the year, fights are undefeated Festus Ahorlu at Cage Warriors 140, wins again by finish. I think the thing with Kalen is, like I said, he's a massive bantamweight, not in height, but in width and in stockiness. Like, he's a really big bantamweight, and he steamrolls people. He uses his cardio, he uses all that power that he has, very dominant on the ground. Someone that once he gets on top, you can't get him off you. He's going to end up submitting you or knocking you out. And we saw that against Festus Ahorlu. And then the Luke Shanks fight. I mean, how can you not give this man newcomer of the year after he made Luke Shanks just look like a random regional fighter? And we're talking about Luke Shanks, former champ. He's fought everyone. He's fought Josh Reed, Creasy, he's fought LeBlond, he's fought Hadley. He's just fought a who's who at 135 in the UK. And Kalen made him look like an amateur. And that's no disrespect to Luke. I've got an immense amount of respect for Luke, and I think he's a great fighter. But Kalen just goes in there and dominates. And that's what he did all of 2022. I'm not even sure that the guy lost a round in 2022. Finishes all his fights. He's a scary prospect. And I don't say that lightly. I really think in 2023, don't be shocked if you see this man fighting for a belt. Don't be shocked if you see this man beating a lot more 35ers that you probably hold in high regard. And don't be shocked if he gets signed to a major organization in 2023, because I really think that not much can stop this guy. His self belief is right up there. I mean, if you follow him on social media, he believes his source, believes in his own hype. And I think while that ticks off a lot of fans, I think for me, if you're going to be a top fighter, you're going to have that self belief. You can't really succeed in combat sports. Obviously, fighters are going to have mental hardships, and that's part of fighting. But the guys that really do believe in themselves, that have a profound amount of belief, are usually the ones that rise to the top. And I think Kalen Lochran is my newcomer of the year. And I'm going to make a a crazy prediction maybe, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're talking about him in the fighter of the year conversations at the end of 2023. All right, and now we're going to look at the event of the year, which is the last award that will be given out on this show. Event of the year for me was not crazily hard to pick, but there were a lot of nominees, if that makes sense. I knew which one was my number one, but I couldn't deny that there were many, many great cards this year of Cage Warriors. Narrowed it down to four in the end. My God, do I want to? Yeah, let's just rattle them off, right? In no particular order until we obviously talk about the winner. My three nominees, starting off with Cage Warriors 140, which was a McKee versus Burlinson. The reason I've put this in is we had a crazy amount of knockouts on this. We had Michael Chambu won by knockout, Adam Darby won by knockout, James Power beat Adam Shelley. We also had the emergence of Michele Martignoni, so a man who would eventually become champ. We had a tough kind of decision fight between Ryan Shelley, who's one of my favorite guys right now in Cage Warriors. Pasquale and Hardwick, Harry Hardwick, George Hardwick's brother, fought to a draw. Really fun, competitive fight. James Sheehan won by knockout. Kanan Loughran knocked out Festus Aholu, which we've just spoken about. And then in the main event, we had that fight of the year between McKee and Burlinson. Great atmosphere, great card, loads of finishes. Was definitely up there for me as one of the cards of the year. And we had Cage Warriors 144, and I was very close to picking this as number one. This was the Rome card. So you had 8 fights on the card, all Italian fighters. So every fight had an Italian fighter as one half of it versus someone who wasn't Italian, right? Apart from one fight, which was between two Italian dudes, so they were always going to win one. But no, they go on and win every single fight. Sabatino wins, Belandi wins, Zaccaria wins, De Signy wins, Favero wins, Dylan Hazan wins. Then you have Carlo Pedasoli beating Fleminas, who's one of my favorite Cage Warriors fighters. Pedasoli goes in there, submits Fleminas after a really good fight between the two of them. And then you had Michele Martignoni winning the belt against Dominic Wooding, a fight that we didn't really expect Martignoni to win. So the reason that I had that one shortlisted is I've said this in the last pod, I'll say it again. Cage Warriors have done a great job to tap into the Italian market. This card was a culmination and a product of that, and a really good product of that. All the Italian fighters won. The matchmaking, was it favourable towards the Italians? Yes, but by the time you got to the co-main and the main, I thought that Fleminas and Wooding would win. Like, if I'm being completely honest, and Pedasoli and Martignoni had other ideas. The Italians swept the fight, swept the card. They went 8-0. Really impressive stuff. Definitely one of the cards of the year in terms of how memorable it was, the atmosphere, and the crowning of a new champion. My final nominee in this category was Cage Warriors 146. That was in Manchester in November. We had on this card Liam Gittins beat Faisal Malik, which was a big one because Malik is a heavily touted prospect. Gittins knocked him out. Milad Hardy, who I've mentioned, beat Tom Mearns. Samuel Bark, who we've also mentioned, knocked out Manny Akpan, which was awesome. Reese McEwen submits Scolieri. Capera beat Aaron Johnson, really nice heel hook. James Hendon submits Margarian. Sam Kelly submits Jack Eglin. And then you had Antonio Sheldon and Geordie Bax. That was a really good competitive fight. Ends in a draw, split draw. Luke Riley knocks out Cotilla. Adam Cullen knocks out Martin Cause. And I'm sorry to be reading this off, but the amount of craziness that happened on this card is a 15 fight card. Stipe Burchik beating Aaron Arby. Stipe Burchik beating Aaron Aby. You had Chuck Campbell knocking out Andy Clamp. That's what got him the title shot against Bakauskas. And then you had Jim Allhead winning the belt, which was insanely special. And Christian Leroy Duncan punching his ticket to the UFC, more or less, by beating Marian Dimitrov had the spinning elbow and the punches. Really nice finish, really nice card. 15 of them. I hate cards that have more than 10 or 11 fights, but this one didn't drag. It was really well paced, and it was definitely right up there for card of the year. But I couldn't look past Cage Warriors 136 for my personal and the Yellow Gloves event of the year. This one was early in 2022, Saturday, 2nd April 2022. Every single fight on this 13 fight card ended in a finish. Every single one, bar none. Michael Chamu beat Piotr. Chasen Blair had his knockout over Ricky Moore. Jan Quayhagens beat Kieran Lister. That wasn't the knockout that Quayhagens got nominated for finish of the year. It was over Eric Da Silva, but still a good finish if you want to go back and watch it. Dylan Hazan beat Ramison Bruno. There was a retirement in between rounds for that fight. Manny Akpan has the insane knockout over Connor Hitchens. So already, at that point, we're still in the prelims and we're getting to, these insane finishes, right? Liam Malloy beats Ben Rees. That was a really good knockout win. And then you had Mantikivi beating Castro, Mick Stanton beating Fontes, Luke Riley knocks out Jack Eglin, which was a great fight. Reese McEwen chokes out Sam Spencer. Adam Cullen beats Ndai. Aaron Abbey beats Gerardo Fanny. And stop laughing at that name. I can hear you laughing in the background. Christian Leroy Duncan versus Jati Milan. Milan looks great to start the fight. Then Christian Leroy Duncan does his crazy stuff, flying knee, punches, got nominated for my personal uh, shortlist for Knockout of the Year. This card just had the insanity, had the craziness. Maybe it didn't have the moments that some of the other ones did, though we did have the crowning of a new champ, which always takes precedence. It didn't have the story of the Italy card. It didn't have the the same thing as the Judo Jim winning his belt and everything. But when you tune into a card and every fight's a finish, there's not much that you can ask for, right? And a lot of this, the great thing about this card is it wasn't just first round finishes. I think we had 5 or 6 third round finishes, including the main event. So we still managed to see fights last a while and get to see good technical battles between fighters before the finishes happen. I just think, for me, if you have a card and every fight ends in a finish, that's pretty historic and it's pretty special and it should be celebrated. So that's my Cage Warriors event of the year. All right, and that wraps up the 2022 Yellow Glove Awards. Just to recap, we had Fighter of the Year go to George Hardwick, Fight of the Year, Reese McKee versus Justin Burlinson, Finish of the Year, Judo Jim over Matt Figlak, Performance of the Year, Paul Hughes over Jordan Vucenic, Newcomer of the Year, Kalen Loughran, and Event of the Year, Cage Warriors 136, Jati Milan versus Christian Leroy Duncan. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Very good year for Cage Warriors. A lot of special moments, a lot of great finishes, a lot of memorable fights. I think to put a bow on 2022, definitely one of the stronger years in Cage Warriors history, and one that people should celebrate. And I hope that this episode has done a good job of celebrating the fighters who, even if they didn't win the fights they were in, those who were one half of Performance of the Year, one half of Fight of the Year, even though they lost, they still played a part in that piece of history, right? I hope that everyone who's listening to this enjoyed the podcast. If you did, please leave a rating or review wherever you're listening to this on. So this will be on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. I'll have a version up on YouTube as well. Comments, likes, and stuff like that, retweets on Twitter. All it does is it helps spread the word. We're one of the very few Cage Warriors podcasts around. I don't know that there's a podcast that's directly and solely focused on covering this organization. So we probably have a bit of a niche in the market there. So if you want to spread the word, please feel free to do so. Any positive or negative feedback, I'm always happy to take on. So thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.